If a trap ever tells you it caught the wrong thing, you listen, Ethan Cole muttered, staring at the blinking warning on his handheld scanner as it flickered between error codes it had no business displaying. The kind that usually meant either a fried circuit or something the system couldn't classify. And out here on a dry stretch of frontier rock, where the nearest settlement sat 70 miles away and the wind carried more dust than sound, unknown biology wasn't a comforting option, it was a problem. And Ethan didn't like problems that didn't fit into categories, especially not one sitting inside a steel snare he'd set 12 hours ago for something small, something edible, something predictable. Not this, never this. He crouched anyway, because survival had a way of pushing curiosity ahead of common sense, fingers brushing the release latch, while his mind quietly listed all the reasons to walk away. Broken tech, bad signal, maybe some weird cross-species animal he hadn't seen before, except the scanner wasn't wrong about weight, 6 feet long, roughly human mass. And that was where the list stopped being helpful. Great, he said under his breath. Either I'm about to meet something new, or I'm about to regret everything. The trap hissed as it loosened, metal retracting with a reluctant sigh, and for a split second nothing happened. Just heat shimmering above the sand and the distant hum of the planet's atmosphere, doing whatever it did to make everything feel slightly off, like gravity itself was in a polite disagreement with reality. Then he saw her, not a creature, not anything he could file under survival guide chapter headings, a woman, an alien woman, pale skin catching the light with a faint, almost metallic sheen, dark hair tangled against the edge of the trap, and ears, long, elegant, unmistakably not human, angled slightly back as if reacting to something he couldn't hear. Ethan froze because there wasn't a protocol for this. There wasn't a manual for opening your trap and finding a person who clearly didn't belong in it, let alone one who looked like she had stepped out of some high-level system he had no clearance to even think about. Okay, he said quietly, mostly to himself. This is new. His scanner chirped again, louder this time, then died completely as if it had decided it wanted no part in what was happening. And that was when her eyes opened, sharp, focused, not confused, not afraid, locked directly onto him with a precision that made his chest tighten for reasons he couldn't explain. She didn't flinch, didn't scramble, didn't even look at the trap holding her in place. She looked at him like he was the anomaly, like he was the thing out of place. And when she spoke, her voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. You're not supposed to be here, she said. And Ethan exhaled slowly because somehow that was worse than everything else. Worse than the broken scanner. Worse than the impossible biology. Worse than the fact that he had just caught something. Or someone who clearly knew more about this situation than he did. And for the first time since he'd landed on this planet, Ethan had the distinct feeling that whatever came next wasn't going to be something he could walk away from. For a moment, Ethan considered the possibility that he had finally pushed his luck too far, and the planet had decided to respond with something that looked human just to make the situation more complicated. Because nothing about the woman in his trap behaved the way an injured stranger should. She did not panic, did not ask for help, did not even try to pull free right away. She simply watched him with a level of focus that made him feel like he was the one being evaluated, and Ethan had spent enough years in places where people judged quickly to recognize that kind of attention. It was not curiosity. It was assessment, the kind that ended in decisions he might not like. That makes two of us, he said after a second, because silence felt like a bad move and humor had gotten him through worse situations. I was not planning on being here either. Her gaze did not shift, not even slightly. And up close he could see details his first glance had missed, faint lines along the edge of her ears that looked almost like embedded patterns, not scars, not decoration, something intentional. Something precise, and the fabric she wore was wrong for this part of the system. Too clean, too structured, even damaged it held its shape like it had been designed to. You should leave, she said quietly. And that was new, not a threat, not a warning in the usual sense, more like a statement of probability, as if she was informing him of the outcome rather than advising him on a choice. Ethan glanced at the horizon out of habit, expecting nothing, because out here nothing usually stayed nothing. But the air had shifted. The faint hum he had ignored earlier was building into something more defined, a distant vibration that did not belong to wind or weather, That sounds like the kind of suggestion people regret ignoring, he replied, already reaching for the release mechanism on the trap fully now. Because whatever she was, whatever this situation had become, leaving her pinned in place felt like the fastest way to make it worse. The metal frame disengaged with a soft click and retracted completely, and she did not move immediately, which somehow made it more unsettling. She simply remained where she was for half a second longer, as if confirming that the change had happened. Then she shifted, slow, controlled, testing balance rather than rushing to escape. Ethan noticed that too. The lack of urgency, the absence of fear, it did not match the environment or the situation. You are making a mistake, she said, rising to her feet with a steadiness that suggested the injury was either less severe than it looked or she was very good at ignoring it. Ethan shrugged slightly, stepping back to give her space because that seemed like the correct decision in a moment that had very few clear rules. That is a long-standing tradition for me, he said, and this time, for the briefest second, something changed in her expression, not quite a smile, not even close, but a shift, a flicker of something that recognized the tone, if not the words. Her eyes moved past him then, focusing on the sky behind his shoulder, and Ethan did not need to turn to know that whatever had been building in the distance had arrived. The vibration was no longer distant, it was present, layered, controlled, the kind of sound that came from something engineered with purpose. They are early, she said, more to herself than to him. And that single line carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, because it implied expectation, planning, a timeline that did not include him. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm what his instincts had already decided. Dark shapes cutting through the upper atmosphere, too precise to be natural, too organized to be anything but intentional. And suddenly the empty stretch of land he had been standing on felt very, very visible. He exhaled slowly, because at this point the situation had moved beyond confusing and settled comfortably into inevitable. Let me guess, he said, keeping his voice even. This is the part where things get complicated. She looked back at him then, and for the first time since he had opened the trap, there was something unmistakable in her gaze. Not uncertainty, not fear, but decision. And when she spoke again, it was quieter, sharper, and somehow far more dangerous than before. They are not here for you, she said. Then after a fraction of a second, added, but they will notice you. And that, Ethan realized, was probably worse. The ships did not roar the way human engines did. They pressed into the sky with a controlled hum that felt less like noise and more like pressure, like the air itself had agreed to move aside for them. And Ethan stood there watching as three of them slowed overhead, their silhouettes too clean, too deliberate, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand until they reached his boots. And for a second, he considered the possibility that staying still might somehow make him less noticeable, which was not how visibility worked, but was occasionally how survival felt. You were expecting them, he said, not taking his eyes off the sky, and beside him she did not deny it. She simply adjusted her stance slightly, subtle, efficient, like someone aligning herself with a situation rather than reacting to it. Yes, she answered, and that single word carried confirmation without explanation. Ethan nodded once, because that fit the pattern forming in his head. This was not random. None of this was random, which meant the only unpredictable variable in the equation was him. Good, he said quietly. I like being the unexpected part. Her eyes flicked toward him again, sharper this time, as if reassessing that statement. But before she could respond, the nearest ship descended lower, not landing, not fully, just enough that the air beneath it shifted in a controlled ripple, sand lifting and settling in precise patterns, rather than chaotic gusts, and a line of figures emerged from the underside, their movement synchronized without looking forced, armor reflecting the filtered light in a way that suggested function over display. They did not rush, did not scatter. They advanced in a straight line toward the two of them, as if the distance had already been measured and agreed upon. Ethan felt the instinct to step back, rise, and then settle, because stepping back implied retreat, and he had learned that retreat only worked when the other side recognized it as such. These did not look like the kind who misread signals. Stay where you are, the woman said softly, not looking at him, not raising her voice. But the tone shifted just enough that it stopped being advice and became instruction. Ethan glanced at her, one brow lifting slightly. "That sounds like a request I am going to regret following," he said, but he did not move, because something in her posture, in the way she had not once shown concern for herself, suggested that she understood this situation in a way he did not, and for now that was a useful arrangement. The figure stopped about 20 feet away, evenly spaced, forming a line that felt less like a barrier and more like a boundary. And for a moment no one spoke, the silence settling with weight, the kind that made small movements feel louder than they were. Then one of them stepped forward, helmet retracting smoothly to reveal a face that shared her features in structure if not in expression, the same elongated ears, the same controlled composure. "Your Highness," he said, and the title landed in the air with quiet finality. Ethan exhaled slowly because that answered the last question he had been avoiding. Not just important, not just unusual, royal. Of course it was royal, because apparently his life had decided subtlety was optional. "You are early," she replied, her voice calm, unchanged, and the man inclined his head slightly. "The situation required adjustment," he said, his gaze flicking toward Ethan for the briefest moment before returning to her, not dismissive, not aggressive, simply noting, cataloging. Ethan resisted the urge to wave, because this did not feel like a situation improved by introductions. "We will secure the area," the man continued, and that was when the shift happened, small but unmistakable, her posture straightened by a fraction, her presence sharpening. The same woman who had been lying in a trap minutes ago now standing as if the ground itself recognized her authority. "No," she said, and the single word carried more weight than anything spoken so far. The line of soldiers did not move, did not question, but the pause that followed was different now, charged, waiting. She turned her head slightly toward Ethan, just enough that he could see the edge of her expression, and when she spoke again, it was not to the soldiers, it was to him. "Do not move," she said, quieter this time, and then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a single measured step before turning back to face the line, her voice steady. "Absolute. He stays." And this time, no one mistook it for a suggestion. The silence that followed did not feel like hesitation. It felt like recalculation, as if every person standing in that line had just been handed new variables they had not prepared for, and Ethan could almost see it happen. The slight shift in posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of control, not resistance, not disobedience, just the quiet friction of protocol meeting something that overrode it. The man who had spoken before inclined his head again, slower this time, not in agreement. Not exactly. More like acknowledgement of a command that carried weight beyond his authority. "Understood," he said carefully, but his eyes moved again, briefly, toward Ethan, and this time the look lingered a fraction longer. Enough to say that whatever had just been decided did not include comfort. Ethan exhaled through his nose because he recognized that look too. It was the same one people gave when something small had suddenly become significant and no one was entirely sure why. "I am starting to feel like I accidentally signed up for something," he said quietly, mostly to himself, but the woman beside him heard it. Of course she did. Her ears shifted slightly, angling back and then forward again in a motion so subtle it might have been missed if he had not been paying attention. And for the first time since the ships arrived, she did something unexpected. She reached out, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a controlled movement, and her hand closed lightly around his wrist, not restraining, not pulling, simply there, deliberate, intentional. Ethan stilled, not because he felt threatened, but because the gesture did not match the situation. This was not how people acted in front of a formation of soldiers who were clearly waiting on the next command. This was something else, something quieter but somehow more decisive. "Do not speak unless I tell you to," she said, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond him. And there was no edge to it, no impatience, just certainty. Ethan nodded once because arguing felt like a poor investment at the moment. "That seems fair," he replied, keeping his tone even, and she released his wrist as smoothly as she had taken it, turning back to face the line as if the moment had not happened, but Ethan knew it had, because the soldiers had seen it too. Maybe not the words, but the contact, the choice, and choices like that did not go unnoticed in environments built on hierarchy. The man in front shifted his stance slightly, just enough to signal that something had changed in his understanding of the situation. "We will prepare transport," he said, his voice more formal now, more precise. "Your presence here is no longer secure." And that word, secure, landed differently than Ethan expected, because it implied that this location had once been acceptable, that her being here had not been an accident. "Not entirely." "No," she said again, and this time the response came faster, sharper, not louder, but with less space around it. "We adjust," she added, and the phrasing was deliberate, not refusal for the sake of it, but a redirection. The man paused, and Ethan could see the calculation again, the silent exchange between what was expected and what was required. "As you wish," he said finally, and stepped back into line, the formation holding steady. But the atmosphere had shifted, less rigid, more watchful, like a system that had updated itself but had not yet fully processed the new parameters. Ethan glanced up at the ships again, noting how they maintained position without drifting, without noise, like they were anchored to something invisible. And for a moment, he wondered how long they had been capable of that, how far beyond anything he understood this technology actually went. Then he looked back at her, really looked this time, not as the person he had found in a trap, but as the person these ships had come for. And the difference was not in her appearance. It was in the way everything else adjusted around her. The soldiers, the air, even the silence seemed to recognize her presence as something central, something that defined the situation rather than reacted to it. And that realization settled into place with uncomfortable clarity, because it meant one thing he had been avoiding finally became unavoidable. This was never about what he had caught. It was about what had found him, and as if confirming that thought, she spoke again, without looking at him, her gaze fixed ahead, her voice steady. "You will come with us," she said, not asking, not offering, simply stating what would happen next. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, because of course he would, because at this point walking away would not just be difficult, it would be irrelevant. "I had a feeling you were going to say that," he answered, and somewhere behind the line of soldiers, something in the air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like the next part of the story had already started moving toward them, whether he was ready or not. The word "come with us" settled into the space between them with a weight that felt heavier than the ships overhead, not because of what it meant, but because of how inevitable it sounded, like something that had already been decided long before Ethan ever set that trap. He glanced once toward the distant ridge where his camp sat just out of sight, a collection of practical choices and quiet routines that suddenly felt very far away, then back at her, and for a second he considered asking the obvious questions. Where, why, how long? But the way she stood there, composed, unhurried, made it clear that those answers would arrive when they were meant to, not when he asked for them. "I assume there is not a polite way to decline that," he said, and this time the corner of her expression shifted again, that same almost not smile that never quite became one. "No," she replied simply, and then she turned, not toward the ships directly, but slightly off to the side, as if aligning with something only she could see. One of the soldiers stepped forward at a subtle signal, not from her voice, not from a gesture, but from presence alone, and extended a small device no larger than a phone, its surface smooth and unmarked. "For transit clearance," he said, his tone respectful but measured, and his eyes did not meet Ethan's fully this time. They paused just short, as if direct contact might complicate something already uncertain. Ethan took the device because leaving it hanging felt like a worse option, and the moment his fingers closed around it, the surface came alive, light, spreading outward in a soft pattern that did not resemble any interface he had used before. No buttons, no prompts, just recognition, immediate and silent. The soldier's posture shifted, barely, but enough, and Ethan noticed, because he had spent too long in situations where small reactions meant more than big ones. "That is new," Ethan said quietly, mostly to himself, but no one corrected him, which was almost more interesting than if they had. The device dimmed again as quickly as it had activated, returning to its neutral state, and the soldier inclined his head once before stepping back into position, the formation adjusting without looking like it moved. Ethan handed the device back slowly, because There did not seem to be a reason to keep holding on to something that clearly did not belong to him. And as he did, he caught the briefest glance exchanged between two of the soldiers. Not confusion, not alarm, something closer to recalibration, like a system quietly updating its expectations. "We should move," she said. And this time there was a slight edge of urgency beneath the control, not fear, but timing. Ethan nodded, because that made sense. The longer they stood out here, the more this situation turned from contained to visible. And visible rarely helped. They started walking, not rushed, not slow, a measured pace that matched the distance closing between them and the nearest ship. The air felt different as they approached, cooler, more structured, like stepping into a space that had already been prepared. Ethan kept his eyes forward, but his awareness stayed wide, tracking the subtle shifts around him. The way the soldiers repositioned without blocking him, the way none of them stepped too close, the way every movement seemed to account for him without acknowledging him directly. And that was when it clicked, not fully, but enough to change how he stood. This was not just about her anymore. Whatever had happened when he touched that device, whatever it had read, it had placed him somewhere in their understanding that he did not yet comprehend. And that was the kind of detail that mattered later. The kind that turned small decisions into large consequences. He exhaled slowly, because that realization did not come with instructions. And as they reached the shadow beneath the ship, she slowed slightly, just enough that he came level with her. And without looking at him, without breaking stride, she spoke again, quieter now, almost lost beneath the hum of the engines. "Do not let them decide what you are," she said, and Ethan blinked once. Because that was not the kind of advice you gave to someone who did not matter. That was the kind of warning you gave to someone who was about to. And for the first time since all of this started, the situation did not just feel unavoidable, it felt personal. Stepping beneath the ship felt less like walking into a vehicle, and more like crossing an invisible boundary where the rules quietly changed. The heat of the desert faded almost instantly, replaced by a controlled coolness that carried no scent, no dust, no trace of the world he had just left behind. And Ethan slowed without meaning to, his instincts recalibrating to a space that felt engineered down to the smallest detail. The floor beneath his boots adjusted subtly, leveling his balance before he could even register the shift. "I prefer my gravity honest," he muttered under his breath, and though he had not intended for her to hear it, her ears angled slightly in his direction, catching the words with precision that made him suspect very little escaped her notice. They moved deeper into the craft, the soldiers dispersing with quiet efficiency, not abandoning formation but redefining it. Positions shifting to accommodate corridors and thresholds without ever breaking the sense of structure. Ethan noticed how none of them walked ahead of her. None of them blocked her path. Everything oriented around her presence without needing to be told. And that detail settled into his understanding more firmly than any title could have. This was not just hierarchy. This was something closer to alignment. Like the entire system knew where it was supposed to center. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, smooth surfaces curving into one another without visible seams. Light flowing along the walls and slow pulses that adjusted as they entered. Not brightening, not dimming, just responding. Ethan paused for half a second longer than necessary, because the room felt like it was observing him back, and he had learned to respect spaces that behave that way. "You are adapting quickly," she said, stepping forward without looking back, her voice carrying easily in the quiet, and Ethan followed because standing still felt like the wrong kind of statement. "I have always been good at pretending I understand things," he replied, and that earned him another one of those almost reactions, subtle, controlled. But there, she stopped near the center of the chamber, turning slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to bring him into her field of attention. And for a moment the movement of the room itself seemed to settle, like it was waiting. "They will ask questions," she said, and the phrasing mattered. Not if, not might. "Will. They will try to define you," she added, and Ethan considered that, because it matched what he had already started to suspect. Whatever had happened with that device outside, whatever it had read, it had changed how he fit into this situation. "People do that," he said, keeping his tone even. "It makes them feel better about things they do not understand." Her gaze held on him for a second longer, searching, measuring. Then she inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the answer rather than agreeing with it. "Do not make it easy for them," she said, and this time there was a faint edge beneath the control, not urgency, not quite, but something closer to intent. Ethan nodded once, because that was advice he could work with. "That part one can do," he replied, and for a brief moment something shifted in her posture, a fraction of tension easing, so slight it might have been imagined if not for the way her shoulders settled by a degree that did not match the rest of her composure. Then the chamber changed again, the light along the walls brightening in a slow, deliberate wave, and a low tone resonated through the floor, not loud, not intrusive, but unmistakable, a signal, a transition. Ethan glanced toward the far side of the room where a section of the wall dissolved into transparency, revealing another space beyond, larger, more structured, filled with figures waiting in stillness that felt practiced, deliberate, and he exhaled slowly because he recognized that posture too. Not casual, not relaxed. This was anticipation, the kind that came before decisions were made. That would be them, he said quietly, and she did not deny it. She stepped forward instead, crossing the threshold without hesitation, then paused just long enough at the edge to speak without turning back. "Stay with me," she said, and it was not a command in the way the others had been, not directed at the room, not meant to carry. It was specific, quiet, and for the first time since he had opened that trap, it sounded less like authority and more like choice. Ethan followed, because at this point, there was no version of this story where he did not. The moment Ethan stepped through the threshold, the room acknowledged it, not with sound, not with movement, but with attention, a quiet, collective shift that pulled every gaze toward him and held it there. And he felt it immediately, the weight of observation settling in layers, measured, deliberate, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. The figures arranged across the chamber did not react the way humans did. There were no whispers, no sudden movements, just stillness that somehow carried more intensity than noise ever could. And Ethan had the distinct impression that he had just become the most interesting variable in a room that did not like surprises. He kept his posture neutral, hands relaxed at his sides, because anything else would have been a statement, and he was not yet sure what statement would be safest. She moved forward without hesitation, her presence cutting a clear path through the space. And the others adjusted subtly, not stepping back, not yielding in a visible way, but aligning. The same pattern he had seen outside, only sharper here, more defined. And when she stopped at the center, the room seemed to settle into place around her, like everything had been waiting for that exact position. Ethan remained half a step behind, close enough to be included, far enough not to interrupt whatever structure this was. "Report," she said, and the single word carried across the chamber without effort. Not raised, not forced, simply heard. One of the figures stepped forward, older, his posture rigid in a way that suggested long practice rather than tension. His eyes flicked toward Ethan once, quick, precise, then returned to her. "Search perimeter secured," he said, voice controlled. No external interference detected. There was a pause, small, but intentional. "However," he added, and that word shifted the air just enough to be noticed. "The anomaly remains unclassified." Ethan resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, because he was fairly certain he was the anomaly being discussed, and turning would only confirm it in a way that felt unnecessary. She did not respond immediately, and that silence carried meaning, not uncertainty, not confusion, evaluation, the kind that happened in layers. "Clarify," she said finally, and the man inclined his head slightly. "The device registered him," he said, and this time he did not avoid looking at Ethan, his gaze direct, analytical, but not within known parameters. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, because that matched what he had already experienced, the scanner failing, the device reacting in ways it should not have, and now this. A room full of people who clearly expected systems to work suddenly dealing with one that did not. "That sounds inconvenient," Ethan said before he could stop himself, the words slipping out in the same tone he used when commenting on broken equipment or bad weather. And the room did not react outwardly, but something tightened, attention sharpening by a degree that made the space feel smaller. She did not turn toward him, did not correct him, but her ears angled slightly in his direction, acknowledging the interruption without giving it weight. "Continue," she said, and the man complied, though his voice carried a new edge of caution. "We recommend containment protocols until classification is achieved," he said, and there it was. The word Ethan had been expecting, not because of what he had done, but because of what he was, unknown, undefined, something systems did not like. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not stepping back, not forward, just enough to remind himself that he was still standing on solid ground. "That sounds like a polite way of saying you want to put me somewhere small," he said, keeping his tone even, because if they were going to talk about him like he was a problem, he might as well acknowledge it. This time the reaction was clearer, not loud, not dramatic, but present, a subtle ripple through the room, the kind that happened when expectations were challenged in a way no one had prepared for. And then she spoke, cutting through it cleanly. "No," she said, and the word carried more weight than the entire discussion that had come before it. The man paused, recalculating, and Ethan watched the shift happen again. The same pattern, protocol meeting something that overrode it. "He is not to be contained," she continued, her voice steady, absolute. And for the first time since entering the chamber, she turned her head fully toward Ethan, her gaze locking onto his with that same precision from before, the same recognition that did not belong in a first meeting. "He remains under my authority," she said, and the room did not argue, did not question. But the silence that followed was different now, heavier, because whatever definition they had been trying to assign to him had just been replaced with something else entirely, and Ethan realized, with a clarity that settled deep and did not move, that he had not just been noticed, he had been claimed. The word authority did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the room like a final line in a conversation no one intended to continue. And Ethan could feel the shift it caused, subtle but absolute. The kind of change that did not need to be announced because everyone present understood exactly what it meant. The man who had been speaking lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, not even in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a boundary that had just been drawn. "Understood, Your Highness," he said, and the title carried a different weight now, less formal, more anchored, as if it had just been reinforced by something visible rather than assumed. Ethan remained where he was, aware that moving without purpose would only complicate a situation that was already carefully balanced. And for a moment the room held steady, waiting for the next instruction, but none came immediately. She did not rush, did not fill the silence. She allowed it to exist, and Ethan began to understand that. This, too, was control, not speaking until speaking mattered. "You will stand down," she said finally, her gaze moving across the line of figures with quiet precision. And though the words were simple, the effect was immediate. The tension that had been held just beneath the surface eased by a degree, not disappearing, but shifting into something more contained, more watchful. The soldiers did not leave, did not break formation, but their posture adjusted, no longer preparing for action, now observing, recalibrating. "And the classification?" the older man asked carefully, his tone measured, not challenging, but not dismissing the issue either, because whatever Ethan represented had not stopped being a problem simply because it had been reassigned. She paused for a fraction of a second, and Ethan saw it again. That layered thinking, decisions unfolding beneath the surface faster than most people could track. "Deferred," she said, and the single word carried more strategy than explanation, because it did not solve the problem. It moved it, postponed it, placed it somewhere she could control it later, and that, Ethan realized, was probably more effective than answering it now. The man inclined his head once more, accepting the adjustment without pushing further, and the room settled again, this time into a quieter state, less charged, but no less attentive. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but to remind himself that he was still part of the equation, even if he did not fully understand the variables yet. And that was when she turned to him, fully this time, her attention narrowing from the room to a single point. "You will remain here," she said, and the phrasing was different, not "come with us," not "stay with me," but "remain," as if this space had already been assigned to him. "That sounds less temporary than I would like," Ethan replied, his tone calm, because panic had never been particularly useful, and her expression did not change, but something in her gaze sharpened, not in warning, but in focus, temporary is relative, she said, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, because that was not exactly reassuring, but it was honest, which he appreciated more than reassurance at this point. She stepped closer then, not enough to invade space, but enough to lower the distance between them to something more direct, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped just enough that it did not carry beyond him. "They will watch you," she said, and he did not need to ask who they were. The entire room answered that question without words. "Let them," he replied, because being watched was not new. Only the context had changed. Her ears shifted slightly, a subtle motion that Ethan was starting to recognize as something between approval and consideration, and for a brief moment, the tension in her posture eased again. Not fully, never fully, but enough to signal that his answer had aligned with something she expected. Then she straightened, turning back toward the others, her presence expanding once more to fill the space. "Prepare for departure," she said, and this time the response was immediate, coordinated, the room moving with quiet efficiency, systems activating, lights adjusting, the controlled hum of the ship shifting into a new pattern that felt like motion even before it began, and Ethan stood there, at the center of it all, aware that he had gone from checking a simple trap in the desert to standing inside something far larger, something structured, deliberate, and very much aware of him. And as the ship began to move, smooth and almost imperceptible, he realized that whatever this was, wherever it was going, he was no longer just along for the ride. He was part of the reason it had started. The motion of the ship never announced itself. It simply happened, a quiet transition from stillness to movement so smooth that Ethan only noticed it because the light along the walls shifted in a pattern that did not belong to a stationary structure. And for a moment he stood there, adjusting to the idea that the ground beneath him was no longer fixed to the planet he had woken up on that morning. The realization settling in layers, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like everything else about this situation, deliberate, controlled, inevitable. He glanced toward the transparent section of the chamber where the desert had been visible before, now replaced by a distant curve of land pulling away beneath them, the horizon bending in a way that made scale feel irrelevant. And he let out a quiet breath because there was no version of this where things returned to simple. She stood a few feet ahead, her posture unchanged despite the transition, as if movement like this was not something she reacted to, but something she expected. And that detail stayed with him longer than the view, because it told him more about her world than any explanation could have. "You do not seem surprised," he said, stepping closer, his voice low enough to keep the conversation contained, and she did not turn immediately, her attention still on the shifting landscape beyond the ship. "I am not," she replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no dismissal, just a statement of fact. Ethan nodded slightly, because that tracked, then glanced back at the room behind them. The soldiers moving with quiet precision, systems adjusting, everything aligning with the next phase of whatever this operation was. "You knew they would come," he said, not quite a question, more a confirmation. And this time she did turn, her gaze meeting his with that same focused intensity that had not faded since the moment she opened her eyes in his trap. "I knew they would find me," she corrected, and the distinction mattered. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that, because being found implied being lost, or at least being somewhere one was not supposed to be, and that added a layer he had not fully accounted for. "And now they have," he said, and she held his gaze for a second longer before responding. "Yes," she said, and then after a brief pause, added, "Because of you." The words did not land like blame, not accusation, but they carried weight all the same. Ethan blinked once, because that was new, not entirely unexpected, but now confirmed. "That feels like a detail you might have mentioned earlier," he said, keeping his tone even, because reacting too quickly never helped. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not regret, not quite, something closer to acceptance. "It would not have changed the outcome," she said, and Ethan considered that, because she was probably right. He would still have opened the trap, still have tried to help, still have ended up here. "That is not as comforting as you think it is," he replied, and for a brief moment, the edge of her composure softened again, just enough to register, then it was gone, replaced by the same controlled presence. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them to something that felt intentional rather than incidental. "They will tell you what you are," she said quietly, echoing her earlier warning. But this time it carried more weight, more urgency beneath the calm. "They will assign meaning based on what they understand." Ethan nodded slowly, because that matched everything he had seen so far. The scanning device, the conversation, the attempt to classify him into something manageable. "And you?" he asked, because that was the part that mattered now. Her gaze did not waver, did not shift, and when she answered, her voice was steady, precise, and somehow more personal than anything she had said before. "I already know," she said, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of implication, of questions that had not yet been asked and answers that had not yet been given. And as the ship carried them farther from the only place Ethan had expected to be, he realized that whatever she believed he was, whatever she had decided in that moment between the trap and now, it was shaping everything that came next. And for the first time since all of this began, he was not just reacting to events. He was part of the reason they were happening. And that realization did not feel like control. It felt like gravity, steady, inescapable, pulling him towards something he could not yet see but was already moving toward him.